Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello, I'm Gareth. Welcome along to Somewhere on Earth. It is Tuesday, the 22nd of October, 2024, as we record this here in our studio in London. Dear listeners and subscribers, I'm doing my official voice here. We have some very exciting news. Yeah, we're delighted to announce that we have just joined the Evergreen Podcast Network. And if you go to our website and then click on the Evergreen logo, you'll be directed to the Evergreen site. And there you can find us, of course, and many, many other top podcasts from around the world. A bit of everything there for you. There's the history, true crime, music, all the kind of genres that you'd want. They're all up there. And a bit of technology. And that brings us to where we are, talking to you. Welcome along. And coming up today. So if you've just found us via the Evergreen platform, because they have recommended us this week as well, I noticed that we're in their trending and new podcast, which is really exciting, then welcome along, folks, from Evergreen and, of course, everybody else. And if you're a first-timer, you are with friends, believe me, you'll be glad that you joined us, because this is the kind of stuff we talk about. If you use GPS, like who doesn't, you might be very glad that you tuned in. And that's because one of the main technologies behind, for instance, your mapping app, maybe on your mobile phone, that technology is vulnerable. And it's not just about your phone. GPS guides aircraft, your online shopping, deliveries, taxis, you name it, logistics. This is pervasive technology. But the question today is, has GPS lost its way? Also today, we're looking at the podcasting business about a year after we last visited that topic. So let's talk about the business sector, whose products you're listening to right now. How is it all evolving in these final months of 2024? It's all right here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. Now, also with us today is our esteemed editor, Anya Liktorovich. If it's your first time meeting Anya, then, well, you're in good company as well. So, hello, Anya. How are you?
Hello. You're being very complimentary today, aren't you?
In a good mood.
Hey.
A new podcasting network. It's exciting, bringing in new listeners. Right, so to business then. If you've flown across, say, the Eastern Mediterranean, maybe the Middle East or Russia recently, there's a reasonable chance that something weird, without you knowing it, has been going on in the aircraft cockpit without you really noticing. As you relax into that in-flight entertainment, tuck into your meal, all is quiet up there at the front on the flight deck as well, until a little alarm comes up on the instrument panel and it shows a navigation error. The aircraft's GPS has gone awry. The plane, luckily, automatically switches to its backup navigation, so everything's fine, but something has interfered with that all-important primary navigation system, GPS. Now, this is all about GPS jamming or spoofing, and it is causing headaches in aviation and indeed other sectors that rely on navigation and timing data, which, well, basically these days is nearly everything. Well, let's hear more about the problem, who might be responsible, and what we can do about it. Ramsey Faragher is an expert in navigation systems, and he's at the University of Cambridge as well, and also Fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation. Welcome along, Ramsey.
Hi there.
So let's just start with the basics then. We know that GPS, that's the global positioning system, and, you know, for instance, I have Google Maps on my phone and it relies partly on GPS. But it's one of a suite of technologies, isn't it, called GNSS. So what are GNSS?
Yeah, so the global navigation satellite systems are 4 big constellations of satellites. One that's American, the GPS one, the one that's most famous really. And then there's a Russian one called GLONASS. There's a European one called Galileo and a Chinese one called Beidou. And your smartphones and most of the other systems that you'll buy, like running watches and the tech in your car, will use all of those all the time. So you're highly robust to any problems with any one of those satellite constellations. But The aviation sector typically relies just on GPS, which is why there is so much.
So GPS then, it relies on satellites then, isn't it? So you have this constellation of satellites, and what happens? They send timing signals down, don't they, or something, so that your phone or whatever, your device, can figure out where on the surface of the globe it is. Is it that?
Yes. Each of the satellites is basically a bank of atomic clocks set up with a radio and some solar panels and a little bit of computer code. And the satellites all transmit the time at the same time. And when you pick up the timing signals from those different satellites on the surface of the Earth, your receiver does a little bit of maths and it works out exactly where you are and exactly when you are. So you don't just calculate your position to within a few meters, you calculate universal time to within a few nanoseconds. And so GPS has become very, very important, not just for navigating to the shops, but it's also become very important for synchronizing lots of very complicated systems all around the world.
So that brings us to this jamming and spoofing issue. And some people use those words interchangeably. They have an important difference, don't they? But first of all, let's do the easy one. What do we mean by GPS or GNSS jamming?
So jamming is when you transmit noise to just block someone's use of a radio signal. And so it can be as simple as just turning on a radio receiver and having it feed back a microphone straight back into the speaker and just making noise like that. And so it's very cheap and simple to do. And the big problem with GPS jamming in particular is that the satellites only transmit a 50-watt signal from 20,000 kilometers away out there in space. And so if you're transmitting noise at a much higher power, a few hundred watts or kilowatts, and you're much closer, like just a few hundred miles, then you will easily swamp out the true signal coming from space and just deny the use of it completely.
So you mean so audio feedback is what you described, but then you transmit that on the radio waves as well, then through an aerial of some sort, through some kind of antenna, and then you get that effect, So a weak, by the time it arrives at the GPS receiver, it's a weak signal from the satellite, so it's easy to overwhelm it with these jamming signals and cause a few problems there.
Yeah, the analogy I was using is just exactly that. Many people will be used to hearing a microphone come too close to a speaker and then hear loads of feedback. And that jams the use of the microphone. It's that kind of thing. Anything that's much louder than the true signal just gets swamped completely.
Oh, I get it. Okay. But spoofing is a more elaborate and I'd say more troubling thing in itself, isn't it? What does spoofing mean?
So spoofing is when people transmit fake versions of the true signal. So one of the blessings and the curses of us all being able to use GPS in the civilian sector for going to the shops and stuff is that loads of companies can build GPS receivers because they know exactly what the signal content is that the satellites broadcast. They can decode it, they can translate the data from it, do the maths on it, calculate position fixes. But unfortunately, that also means because we can read all of that data and we understand exactly what it looks like, it's not very hard to knock up your own radio, which is transmitting fake versions of the signals. And then you can make someone else's GPS receiver believe it is wherever you want it to be.
Ramsey, what happens if an aircraft has been jammed? They've safely landed. Do the pilots know if it's been jamming or spoofing, or was it a malfunction?
So what's happening at the moment is aircraft are experiencing both jamming and spoofing, typically one after the other. So typically they notice they get jammed first, and this is quite easy to see because there's a display always in the cockpit of the navigation information from the GPS and other systems. And the very first thing they notice is that these numbers that are normally showing their latitude, longitude, altitude, and the number of satellites it's using, those numbers just disappear. And so straight away, the pilots can see that either the GPS receiver has failed or it's getting jammed. But then what they're experiencing at the moment happen next is the really difficult problem. So what happens typically next is the numbers come back, but they're completely wrong. And what happens then on board the aircraft is there are lots of systems that use the GPS position and time in order to function themselves. And when those systems are fed complete garbage position and time, it breaks lots of other systems on board the aircraft. And that's the main problem here. As Gareth mentioned at the top of the show, the pilots can navigate without GPS, that's fine. The challenge is multiple other system failures happening because the GPS goes down.
Okay, so when the aircraft actually lands, do all these systems that are affected by the GPS need a full diagnostic? I mean, that would take a long time and be quite costly.
Calling out an engineer to come and look at the aircraft before it's put back into service, maybe.
Yeah, what we are seeing is, again, kind of a full spectrum of impacts. So different aircraft of different ages and types that have different hardware in them are being affected in different ways. And certainly the most serious problems we're seeing is that the GPS receiver itself and other systems on board the aircraft, like the collision avoidance terrain detection system, the data link to the ground, the weather radar, the ADS-B, which is how aircraft tell each other where they are over another radio link. These can all go down, and because they've been corrupted by having incorrect data fed into them, the only trustworthy thing that the pilots can do is reboot each of those systems. And so in flight, you would do that by popping the circuit breakers in and out. But as you might imagine, there's huge reluctance to do that. They're not supposed to be turning systems on and off in flight. And certainly what is generally happening is engineers are coming out every time the aircraft lands and has had these problems. The engineers check each of the systems, and depending on how many systems have gone down, depending on how many engineers there are at the airport, having to deal with X number of aircraft experiencing this every day, we will start to see delays in flights because of this problem, because of the sheer number of engineers needing to go out and reset the systems every single time aircraft fly through these interference regions.
And those extra costs going on to our ticket prices at the end of the day.
Eventually.
Well. Yeah, there we are. Yeah, it all comes round. Let's also hear from Bridget Diakun. She's right here in the studio with us, a Maritime Risk Analyst at Lloyd's List Intelligence. Welcome along to Somewhere on Earth, Bridget. Nice to have you here. So tell us about your role. We're talking about shipping here as well, which I guess the clue's in the title with your job title, Maritime Risk Analyst. So we've spoken about aviation. What about with shipping, and especially your role, which is monitoring for sanctions busting, isn't it? And sanctions evasion and shipping. So tell us how you come into this story.
Okay, so I use AIS data regularly to track ships. So part of that is sanctions evasion.
And just really, sorry, just before you get into your stride, AIS, just help me out with that.
Oh, Automatic Identification System data. So it's the vessel tracking data, what's coming from the ship, where we're getting its positions. So I use that to assess ships' movements. I look to understand how ships respond to geopolitical events, but another big part of my role is sanctions evasion, deceptive shipping practices. Shipping is a huge industry, and it's not scrutinized as much as others. So a lot of nefarious activity happens at sea. So that's where I come in.
Right, so you spend a lot of time monitoring ships' movements using the AIS, as you say. So a little bit like, because I have a plane tracking app on my phone, for instance, that uses a technology that Ramsey mentioned called ADS-B. So you get these transponders on the plane, they get picked up, and then ultimately you can then see if your relatives are on time on their flight coming into the airport. AIS is a similar system, but for ships. And you spend a lot of time tracking vessel movements. So what do you see then if you're looking, say, at a Russian vessel and you're interested in whether it's evading sanctions? What kind of happens? What kind of experiences do you have?
Right now it's chaos, absolute chaos in the Black Sea. It's become significantly worse over the past 3 or 4 months. So we started seeing this spoofing, GPS spoofing, but I will say that's third-party spoofing in the way that we interpret it. So it means that someone else is causing the disruption. It's not happening from the ship. So in the Black Sea, looking at it now, I estimated in August, it was over 160 ships a day that were just going somewhere that wasn't real, and in some instances impossible. And so that's over 1,000 ships a month. And what's really scary is that they're offline for sometimes 5 or 6 days. So we actually don't even see where they load or unload or what they do at all during that time. And then they just kind of come back online and back to the normal journey. But effectively, we can't see anything. So we don't know if they've done a ship-to-ship transfer with a sanctioned ship. We don't know if they've loaded sanctioned cargoes. We don't know if they've gone to the occupied territories. We've got no idea what's happening in a lot of instances.
So you can't do your job?
Well, I mean, that's
another... If they're disappearing for that long, you really have no idea.
You have to work a lot harder. So it's not impossible, but it would certainly put off a lot of people. And the thing is that compliance managers and people who do due diligence rely on this data. So for them, they've already got a really heavy workload because of all of the new sanctions and all of the changes. And now they have to put in that extra effort to figure out what's going on journeys. So you could use satellite, but it depends on that scale of disruption. If it's offline for a couple of hours, not a big deal. I can let that go. But 5 or 6 days, and it is looking for a needle in a haystack, especially if you don't know where you're looking.
And you mentioned the Black Sea. I mean, are you seeing similar issues in other conflict areas?
Yes, East Mediterranean is quite bad. It's not as severe all the time, but it is certainly happening. Red Sea, North Red Sea is really bad as well. Off of Sudan, also not a great area. But again, nothing quite as severe, quite as prolonged as what we're seeing in the Black Sea.
And so what a lot of these places have in common is that they're conflict regions or they're near conflict regions. So might this be a clue as to where this interference is coming from? And you can take this one if you want, Bridget, or we can swing to Ramsey for this one. But, like, who's causing this? Who are these people with these spoofing devices causing chaos?
I can start. I mean, from our perspective, it's all military government forces. It's all in response to what's happening on the ground in those conflicts. And this is just kind of an unintended consequence, a secondary fallout, really, which is a bit scary if it's switches and people want to use this as the primary reason for doing the jamming is to kind of hide the trade that's going on.
And very significant how you said it's not the ships themselves. So it's not some dodgy Russian vessel who's just trying to evade sanctions by deliberately fiddling with their AIS data or hacking their own transponder. It's not that. It's collateral damage, as it were, from wider regional spoofing.
Yes, that's exactly it. So you could get a ship that is spoofing itself. So it would be happening on board. And we do see cases of that. But with the jamming, it's all the ships in one area. So it could be sanctioned ships, it could be ships engaged in legitimate trade. They're all really just the victims at that point, which also adds another element of complexity when you're trying to do due diligence checks.
And tell us about the wider implications. Of course, sanctions compliance is incredibly important. But so what does that mean? Say for people's lives listening to this, if Bridget can't see a whole load of vessels one day, why does that matter to the rest of the world? I know it's a massive question.
That my job is that important.
Well, no, but the thing is, I think it is, but it's certainly part of something very significant, isn't it? Tracking maritime movements for any kind of purpose is important in all kinds of ways, in terms of monitoring sanctions, and really is, these are the machinery of global trade. So this is significant, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. On the broader scale, I mean, are these sanctions being implemented and are they effective? And if we can't see what's going on, then how are we meant to implement sanctions? And if we're not implementing them, then people are still making money. It's fueling wars, it's fueling conflicts, all of that. So it is certainly problematic, but it's a complicated question.
Well, we've talked obviously extensively about aviation and maritime issues here, but there are other areas. What about the US depends on GPS for precision agriculture, and if that's blocked, I mean, how do you sow your seeds? And then everything else is automated. So if you haven't done that initial setup properly, how do you then water, harvest, etc., etc.? The implications of that are actually quite significant. I mean, there's also issues about dating. I mean, not as serious, but on dating apps, locations, because people want to be matched with someone relatively close. They don't want to be traveling to another country to meet someone potentially. Well, they might do, but generally they want someone a little bit closer who they can meet. And if that's having an impact on that and you're being matched with someone who is in another country, then that starts becoming a problem for the app and the success of the app.
I mean, there are people in the north of Lebanon on dating apps who are having suggested dates dished up, from Israel, for instance, so chaos in that area. So, we might say, it's only dating, it's a little bit frivolous, but there's still people's everyday lives that are being affected. And in fact, a friend of mine, a contact of mine in Lebanon, just sent me a screenshot the other day from their pizza delivery. I think a friend of theirs, pizza delivery, and they were tracking the pizza delivery, and it was right out in the middle of the Mediterranean. And by the way, it wasn't on a ship, Bridget. This is some scooter that is allegedly in the middle of the Mediterranean. And I know, Bridget, you've seen ships that appear as if they're on dry land or airports and things like that. I mean, it's crazy. We need to move on and speak to Michael from Evergreen. Just before we do, and we'll come back to you in the podcast subscription extra as well, Bridget. But Ramsey, let's just have a final comment from you, just about any solutions to this. We've painted a slightly, I suppose, grim and worrying picture, but are people working on technologies to try and mitigate all this?
Yeah, definitely. Both large and small, and certainly because, as you were just touching on, things like precision agriculture, there are so many uses nowadays that over $1 trillion of the US economy and €1 trillion of the European economy depend on GNSS. And if GNSS was to go down, then it would have an impact of over $1 billion a day in the US and over €1 billion a day in the EU. So it's really serious. And so there's a whole spectrum of solutions. So our smartphones, for example, the good news for you is that if your GPS chip simply stops working in your phone, you've got Wi-Fi and cellular positioning, and some phones, some of the clever tricks as well, Bluetooth beacons and things. There are other ways that you get that blue dot on your smartphone, especially if you're in cities or in indoor environments. And to go to the extreme of the large maritime and aviation problems we've just been discussing, there's the closest to the magic bullet of solutions for the GNSS jamming and spoofing problem is what's called the controlled radiation pattern antenna, which is basically a very long, complicated name for a very complicated antenna. And this complicated antenna is capable of steering electronic sensitivity such that it can blank out the sources of incorrect broadcasts, jammers and spoofers, and basically only pay attention to the positions in the sky that the true satellites are in. And so there's a lot of activity going on at the moment, assessing, trying to certify these sorts of antennas for the aviation sector. And I'm sure they will come into the maritime sector as well. And it might just be that the problems continue for many years, but clever antennas start to get installed that make the problems go away.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's Ramsey Faragher. We'll hear more from him in the subscription version of this podcast at the end, and also Bridget Diakun, who's with Lloyd's List Intelligence. Right, now I mentioned Michael. This is Michael DeAloia, who is CEO at Evergreen, the podcast network. We just joined that network. And Michael, it is splendid to have you on. Hello, and nice to meet you. How are you?
It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm feeling great today. And we are, by the way, honored that you've joined the podcast network. And what a big thrill that we were in the podcast show in London in May. And now you've joined the network, which is pretty wild. Yeah,
that's right, because our editor, Anya, met you, didn't she, at the podcast show a few months ago?
She did indeed.
Conversations happened, and here we are. And you featured us as well as one of the trending and new podcasts on your network. We appreciate it, Michael. So while we have you, and I could keep this self-congratulation going on for some time, honestly, we are genuinely excited. But it is a good opportunity, Michael, and I think you'll agree, just to take a little look at the podcasting business. And when we first launched this podcast about a year ago, one of our early items was just this whole thing about the podcast business and, how is it monetized? It's a very saturated market. Where's the innovation going on with this? Is it just a bubble? Is it going to burst? All these kinds of things. So, Michael, before we get into that, just perhaps tell us a bit about Evergreen, because I've referred to you, because you refer to yourselves as a network. Are you also a platform, an ecosystem, a community? All of these things? What are you?
Just a brief history. We started off in 2017. Originally, we were called Front Porch People, and we're trying to build a community around friends and family. So our original founder, she had this idea of 1920s radio, 1930s radio, where the family sort of gathered around the radio to listen to shows, and that's what she wanted with podcasting. And so when I joined, that's what we were trying to do, and quickly found out that it's a solitary endeavor, podcasting, meaning as a listener, you want to do it almost alone. Sometimes you have it in the background, but mostly it's through your earpods. And we switched the network from then Front Porch to Evergreen, and we've been on a rocket ship ever since.
And you've grown into a significant business. I think I'm right in saying over 300 titles now on Evergreen. So what's the kind of structure of the business then? Are you a curation platform? Is that one way that we can think of you? Just give us a sense of how this business works.
Well, in the early days, if you had a pulse and a podcast, you probably got on the network. We've gotten a little bit more scientific since then. We obviously were trying to curate around, anchor shows in a particular genre and then build a universe around those shows so that we can then take that out to the marketplace and sell that either through advertising or sponsorship. The curation, you were right. We're over 350 shows and we're beginning to curate on separate networks. So in April, we acquired Converge, which was a faith and family network. And we're really focusing on, I would say, clean comedy, leadership, obviously faith, and trying to curate that content into a very niche marketplace. We're hoping to announce another acquisition, but I think it's going to be in another week or so, which is more Hollywood-driven, A-list, B-list celebrities and stars. So that's obviously very different from Converge and really different from Evergreen. Evergreen, I would like to keep as a platform if you got unique, curious content that stays in an evergreen format, meaning you could go back and listen to this show in particular. You had an earlier segment on GPS, which was just fascinating, by the way. And they could go back and listen to that segment on GPS. They could come back and listen to the segment on podcasting and really get like a snapshot of history.
So you've clearly done a lot of work into understanding where people go to find their podcast, because I wonder for a lot of people, they find their podcast maybe through recommendations, they find them through social media or the podcatcher that gets shipped with their devices and they type in the genre they're interested in and they're served up with podcasts. I'm just trying to think about how people might come to a network like Evergreen. Like, how do you sit within that system as a place where people might go to find their next amazing podcast that they really start enjoying?
It's a fascinating question. Rarely does anyone come to Evergreen to find a true large selection of podcasting. There are two big gatekeepers, as you know, in podcasting, Apple and Spotify. And that's where people are going. So the key for us is try to figure out how to get into their recommendation list, right? So if you're listening to an Evergreen show by chance, say Warriors in their own words, that underneath that selection, you're going to get other Evergreen recommended shows. The thing that those networks really want, Apple, Spotify, is critical mass. They're looking for larger shows that can drive a lot of targeted audience, correct? So in the early days, I mentioned, again, if you had a podcast and a pulse, you probably got on. Today, we really need shows north of 5,000 downloads, but preferably 25 to 50,000 monthly downloads to get into that curation list in Apple and Spotify to, again, help us drive traffic. There are other ways to drive traffic. We've used Rockable campaigns, for example. That's a tool we typically use on episodes that we really want to highlight. And it gives this Marvel movie type kick in terms of downloads. The problem with a Rockable solution, and these are, by the way, digital ads that you might find on all sorts of media platforms. You click on what you think is an ad, and it's actually a player, so it starts playing a show. So, for example, we have a Jackie Onassis show, and you're fascinated by Jackie O. You click on an ad. It starts playing the show. It's a very captivating technology. The problem with those is you get these huge spikes, like a Marvel movie opening, right, that first weekend. And then the second weekend, it drops by about 80, 90%. So we're trying to figure out how to maintain that momentum after that first week. So again, we've really have worked on getting the science correct on the two big gatekeepers to push our shows and to grow the audience that way.
So, Anya, what do you think as you listen to all this, apart from just being relieved it's all happened and that those conversations that you started in May have turned into something? I don't know.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a fascinating journey. I think, I've learned so much personally about, the podcasting world out there and outside the BBC, because obviously that's where we were stationed before. And Evergreen have been fantastic about guiding us through and explaining, and, this is why you're doing this and this is why. And it's just been great working working with the whole team. What I think I really like is that many of our listeners won't actually notice a difference. That should be absolutely seamless. We've transferred onto Evergreen. That should be fine. They may hear more adverts. That certainly that might be there, but we do have control now as to where we put the adverts, because a lot of our listeners complain. They're saying suddenly, you finish a sentence, Gareth, and suddenly something gets popped in.
It's so annoying. I'd spend hours curating some really beautiful scripts, and I was
they're stunning,
delighted with it, darling. Thank you. You can see what I'm fishing for. Or a wonderfully structured and crafted interview, and then suddenly it's like, bang, there's an advert that just goes and spoils the whole thing. But then I think, well, it's keeping the lights on, so I can't complain.
Exactly, we can't complain. But now, hopefully, what we're going to be doing is positioning those more cleverly. And I've actually gone back through the old episodes, so hopefully, if you do go back and have a listen to something you fancy, it should be much more structured. So that's going to be there. But there's always the option of, if you want ad free and you want a little bit extra, that pod extra, $10 a month, US dollars a month, you can go to pod.fan. So we've moved on to there with the subscriptions. Any problems, talk to their live chat. That is actually, I think, the best live chat I've ever had. It
really
works.
Okay, that's live chat that works.
I know. But I just think when I look at the other podcasts, they're, as Michael was saying, they're kind of quirky. They're different. They're stuff that I think I like, and therefore I hope our listeners will like. And you can find some really, really fascinating ones on there.
I'm hoping out of the many quirky and amazing titles that you just mentioned, Anya, people who are listening to them will like this kind of stuff as well. So it cuts both ways. So, Michael, let's finish with not that curveball really, but what about those people, Michael, who say, hey, this podcasting business, and look, Michael, you've been round the block business-wise. I've been reading up on you. You know business very well. You've been in lots of different sectors, and now here you are in the podcasting sector. Is this a bubble? Is it all about to burst? Things like the podcasting show with all its glitz and glamour, give it 5 more years and that conference room's going to be empty. What's going on there? Is this bubble going to burst?
Listen, it's a nascent industry, and with any nascent industry, you generally have a balloon pop early on, which we had a couple years ago. So 3 or 4 years ago, you had the bigger independent podcast networks like Gimlet and Wondery getting acquired by Spotify and Amazon, respectively. And then you had an ad drop in 21 and part of 22. You're starting to see these things pick up quite a bit. In fact, just today, give you some breaking news. Veritone One, which was a large podcasting agency, just got acquired by a private equity group. And I think you're going to start seeing more of this. Groups like Evergreen, Glassbox, Ford, which are some pretty cutting-edge podcast networks. We will get acquired by PE companies. There's too much money on the shelf in private equity and venture capital not to have the second tsunami of dollars flooding into the market. And then you'll see a second bubble. I mean, it's the nature of business, right? Boom and bust. Right now we're in a little bit of a boom, and Evergreen is doing everything we can to capture as much sort of land. We're claiming these lands in the name of Spain, so to speak, bringing on better programming, bigger shows, global shows to drive a bigger audience and therefore drive our revenues a bit more than we have in the past.
All right. Oh, that's a fascinating answer. A lot of that I wasn't expecting you to say, actually. It was genuinely interesting to hear your very realistic and pragmatic view of how industry works and stuff that you've seen before happen in other sectors and applying it to this. Michael DeAloia, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
It's been a thrill. Thank you so much for having me.
And for us, CEO of Evergreen there. So there you go. That's it for Somewhere on Earth for this edition. Originally recorded on Tuesday, the 22nd of October, 2024. You can get in touch with us via hello@somewhereonearth.co. That's our email, hello@somewhereonearth.co. On WhatsApp, we're code 44 74 86 329 484. And a quick reminder, we are a proud partner of the Evergreen Podcast Network. So if you want more information on that and to check out some other titles, then go over to evergreenpodcast.com. So the audio today has been by Keziah Wenham Kenyon and Callum Swingler. The broadcast content team here are Lanson's team Farner. Our production manager right there through the glass is the excellent Liz Toohey. The editor is Anya Literovich, and as if it mattered, I'm some guy called Gareth. See you next time. Bye-bye.